There you go, recording in progress. Welcome to this distinguished lecture put on by the Chinese University of Hong Kong's Research Institute for the Humanities. I'm David Hudder. I'm the director of the Research Institute. It's my great pleasure to welcome today's distinguished speaker, Professor Paul Bowman from the School of Journalism, Media and Culture at Cardiff University in Wales, where he's Professor of Cultural Studies and also Deputy Head of School. Professor Bowman is extremely widely published over a long period of time, many articles and many books, but I'll just highlight a couple. As editor, the Ray Chow Reader, published by Columbia University Press in 2010. And far more recently, his monograph, The Invention of Martial Arts, published by Oxford University Press 2020. He's, I guess you'd say, a specialist in cultural theory, in post-Marxism, pragmatism, things like this, deconstruction, of course. But he's also the director of what's called the Martial Arts Studies Research Network. And obviously these two interests come together, as we're going to see today in this talk, Action Techniques and Anthroptechnics, or what Bruce Lee choreography can teach us about reality. I'll just briefly hand you over to Paul. If you're alarmed by a kind of disjunction between what he's wearing on the screen just below me and what he's going to be wearing in this talk, that's because we are running a video that Paul has put together very helpfully in advance. So this is hopefully going to drive a bit of engagement all the way through the hour. Okay, so Paul, if you just want to say a little bit about what you're going to be doing when the talk is on.
All right, so thank you very much, David, and thank you, everyone. I'm aware of continuity errors, so I'm wearing the same clothes as I am in. I just don't have the same screen behind me because it's not a screen, it's the reel. So what I decided to do, because sometimes my internet is unstable, I decided to ask the Chinese University of Hong Kong to project, to play, share a screen and play a recording that I made. And this will enable me, if you want, to just join in with the chat. If you just type anything as you go along, and then at the end, I can join in with that. And then at the end, I guess David or whoever, we can select what we want to talk about, and then spoken questions can come in at the end as well. But I hope that it works. I've done it once before and it was quite nice. So hopefully we can have a chat while it's rolling in the background, in the foreground. So yeah, just press play, I guess, David, and then we can go for it. Hello, I am Paul Bowman. I'm Professor of Cultural Studies at Cardiff University, and it's a great honour to be asked to give this lecture at the Chinese University of Hong Kong. Today my topic is Bruce Lee Action Techniques and Anthroptechnics, or what Bruce Lee choreography can teach us about reality. So the half-century long debate about how good a fighter Bruce Lee really was may seem both passé to aficionados and intellectually irrelevant to everyone else. However, within the debris of the debate about Bruce Lee's real fighting abilities in relation to his on-screen performances and pedagogical persona, there remain some important insights into cultural issues related to such well-worn themes as the relationships between fiction and representation and reality, acting and doing, being and appearing, as well as questions of embodiment, skill, affect, translation across media, and, as flagged by my title, the rather grand-sounding word anthropotechnics. This is the word that philosopher Peter Sloterdijk uses to theorize human discipline. In a word, training. So my title poses the question of the relationship between fictional dramatic action techniques on the one hand and anthropotechnics, or real physical lived training, enskillment and ability on the other. Our case study is the question of the relationship between filmed fight choreography and so-called real fighting in the world and work of the late, great Bruce Lee, someone who was by turns a great martial arts actor, innovator, teacher, and perhaps also fighter. Of course, this last claim remains a moot point, one that is still debated 50 years after his death, which is of course why I've selected it here. If we leave the question of Lee's innovations and teaching abilities to one side for a moment, we can begin with the binary that people often draw between his acting abilities and his fighting abilities. We might think of all of these realms as separate or separable. Someone could excel at one but suck at the other. However, they both share something in common, something that is expressed by the term performance. Now, performance is an interesting term. It sounds straightforward and is easily used and used correctly in everyday language. One performs something. It is a performance. But even in such everyday usage, performance can mean mutually contradictory things, often at the same time. It's inherently ambivalent or unstable, and hence is a potentially deconstructive word. For when I perform something, I may be either really doing it or merely acting it, or both, sometimes neither. I can be both doing it and acting it and not really doing it, as when a teacher demonstrates a technique and as when students attempt to mimic, replicate and perform it, or as when Bruce Lee performs apparently plausible techniques on screen. Of course, the academic fields of acting and performance studies, not to mention theatre, film and media studies, have known and shown for many years the putative boundaries between supposedly real and supposedly unreal are not only unclear or unstable, they are deeply flawed and problematic, and essentially kind of hysterical. They're hysterical in the sense of being both laughable, and yet also indicative of a kind of neurotic response to some trauma. In this case, that would be the disturbing realization of the impossibility of the ontological viability of these categories themselves, and the reflex desire to cover this over and bury this impossibility, insist on them as real. There's not time here, and to be honest, I don't really want to rake through any scholarly discourse on ontology and epistemology. Nonetheless, I do want to interrogate the place, work, and usefulness of the concept of reality as it exists in and around the discourse of Bruce Lee's performance of combat techniques. To recall, this discourse is structured by the question of the relationship between Bruce Lee's on-screen performance and his real fighting ability. And I've already proposed that the notion of performance gets in the way and complicates matters from the outset. What I want to emphasize here from the beginning may seem obvious to students of philosophy or cultural theory, especially those steeped in post-structuralism or postmodern theory, but it may be less obvious to others. This is the instability and untenability of many common sense and supposedly obvious concepts of the real, notions of the real, beliefs about reality, or feelings about what reality is. These are often naive or crude senses that rely on rough and rarely articulated binaries and syllogisms. In these, reality is equated with something like unmediated materiality, states of nature, the built environment, the Umwelt, or more generally, the outside. In many discourses, from those of political activism to studies of consumer behaviour to the discourse of self-defence, all of this coalesces into one superlative image, the much invoked street. The street is the image of reality. A long time ago, when I was writing about political activism, I coined the term street fetishism for this. But it's best not to do an image search for street fetishism because you definitely won't see political imagery. But to return to my point, the street is the figure of reality. The evocation of the street is the invocation of the image of reality. This is because the man on the street, men on the street, the gang in the street, and so on, these are the figures of real physical and existential threat. The flip side of this is unreality. To follow the same logic, if reality is the physical material of the outside, whether that take the form of nature, stone and rock, or the built form of brick, metal and concrete, then unreality is a product of the inside. At one extreme of the inside we have imagination, fantasy and representation. At the other extreme, things like choreography, performance, act, show, deception. In such schemas, Bruce Lee's action choreographies must be essentially unreal because they are spectacular performances, acts, shows. Worse, they are fake representations of fake situations. Such binary oppositions are what Jacques Derrida termed metaphysical. His term, the metaphysics of presence, identifies what he regards as a central structure of Western thought or belief, the belief in the absolute priority of living, material, face-to-face presence in the present. Everything else is less real because less present. The fact that such binaries are fragile doesn't change the fact that, like film zombies and action movie anti-heroes, they are extremely hard to kill. They are very good at one thing, returning. Translated into the discourse of martial arts, combat and self-defense, the ground, a concrete wall, a street, an aggressive attacker, these are all real. On the other hand, tatami, mats, pads, protective equipment, teachers, rules, drills, rituals, belts, rankings, collaborative training partners. These are somewhat less than real, or different to the real, of the life and death encounter in the street. At best, they are softenings of the real, padded approximations of abstracted elements. If not simply unreal, these might be deemed, in metaphysical common sense, to be dangerous supplements. Not because they're really dangerous, but because they pull one away from the real and into fictional worlds. The ability to view martial arts clubs or styles in this way is one of the reasons why it's incredibly common for practitioners of one style to regard other styles as unreal or as less than completely real or realistic. To regard the training or style of one or another martial art as less or other than real is to deem the human practitioners of that style to be the very embodiments of a fictive representation. Grapplers may regard high kickers as living in the dream world, punchers may regard grapplers as blind to the bigger picture, and vice versa, and so on and so on and so on. You know all of this. The flip side, however, for those who practice martial arts, is that the dojo, class or club does not have the status of a soft play area, but rather that of a scientific laboratory. It's not a dangerous supplement, it's a necessary supplement. Certainly, we do not think of scientific laboratories as places of pointless and ineffectual, unreal simulation, but rather as places of experimenting with the real, of working out ways to intervene and alter real forces, processes, situations and problems. Martial artists may implicitly or explicitly regard their own training halls as laboratories. Martial artists of other styles may regard other clubs as factories. Factories turning out crap. McDojos providing paying customers with happy meals. Products that relate to reality in much the same way that a McBurger relates to actual food. Thus, the binary returns. Such products are held to be not real, but unreal. As I said, the binaries that define the metaphysics of presence are tenacious. They eternally return. Bruce Lee straddles this binary like a colossus. On the one hand, his celluloid choreographies, his fabulous fight scenes, are clearly unreal representations. But on the other hand, as has been acknowledged by myriad fans, viewers, commentators, martial artists and other athletes, something in them seems real, really real. The source of that effect, or rather that affect, seems to relate at once to something in the embodied, end-skilled physicality of Bruce Lee the practitioner or performer, and also to the ways in which that was captured cinematically. Put differently, the reason Bruce Lee's fictional choreography seems to contain something real seems to relate to the fact that he was a brilliant action actor and that this brilliance was captured well on film. But how do we dig deeper into notions like enskilled physicality or brilliance, or such a thing being captured well on film, in order to make their implied meanings less enigmatic. Multiple academic fields can offer terminologies and ways to broach such subjects. However, rather than rushing into academic terminology, I want to first consider the status and usefulness of certain everyday formulations. To start with the most well-known, we might say, for instance, that Bruce Lee was able to sell his techniques well. He could sell a punch, he could sell a kick, and sell the taking of a hit with a kind of compelling, albeit magical, realism. But can we be more precise than that, still without using academic terms? Perhaps. In an article on learning Chinese martial arts, Timothy Nolte proposes a distinction between gong and fa, in which fa refers to the outward form, the rules and principles of execution, the techniques, and gong refers to the effective combative energy, power, or effectivity. The implication is that one might learn the outward form of a style, one might learn to go through the motions, but be unable to put gong into techniques or application, i.e. the correct power in the correct place at the correct time in techniques. Nolte argues that the distinction between gong, skill, and fa, technique, is ubiquitous in Chinese martial arts. He connects these, what we might call emic or practitioner terms, to Maurice Merleau-Ponty's etic or academic notion of embodied intentionality in order to examine them. Of course, the very term embodied intentionality might plausibly be translated almost directly back into the Chinese martial term for intent or intentionality, yi, which itself can sometimes be taken as a cognate or alternative form for gong. And perhaps all of this could be related back to Bruce Lee's lesson for his student Lao at the start of Enter the Dragon, namely his injunction, we need emotional content. In these terms then, Bruce Lee would be a practitioner whose performances either demonstrate, capture, communicate or convey gong in techniques. His performances don't simply depict fa or technical correctness. In fact, sometimes they don't. Rather, they seem to communicate gong or power, perfectly timed and perfectly directed. If this all sounds too abstract or hagiographic, let's clarify via a counter-example. The music video for the song Knights of Sidonia by the rock band Muse. I discussed this video in my 2021 book, The Invention of Martial Arts. I love it, and I return to it because it captures so well the badness of so many representations of martial arts combat. The genius of the choreography in the Knights of Sidonia video is that all of the techniques are ever so slightly wrong in just about every possible way. The timing is wrong. The balance or movement of weight is wrong. The postures are wrong. The interaction with combatants is wrong. Everything is ever so slightly wrong. But it is wrong in exactly the ways that all bad choreographies are wrong. From failed fight scenes in film and television programs to failed fight scenes in dojos and gyms to failed fight scenes on the streets. All the actors sell the punches, kicks and throws, but we don't buy any of it. And this is clearly deliberate. The video brilliantly captures the badness of bad choreography. One thing the video clarifies is that without elementary physiological correctness, no technique can look right. I can show you two slow motion versions of a hook punch, for example. One that involves the raising of my elbow, the bending of my knees, the bracing of my head, the movement of my weight, and the twisting of my foot, and so on. And another that just involves the arcing motion of my arm in isolation. And you will know immediately which one has the potential to be the better punch. This first relates to fa, or physiological mechanical correctness. But importantly, only one version has the potential for gong, the technically correct version. But gong is not manifest yet. Gong would only be manifest in the actual, effective and efficient power-conveying delivery of a technique. Two quick examples might illustrate this. First, an example about athletes and Bruce Lee's acting. Second, an example from a Jackie Chan documentary. So, athletes first. More than one boxer and martial artist has stated that they learned how to put total body power into their punches by watching Bruce Lee on screen. Bruce Lee captured and conveyed the energy and effort of putting power into techniques. The question of whether he was acting or enacting could become a mise en abîme here. But really it's a trompe-l'oeil. This is because the notion of performance encompasses both acting and enacting. In Nietzsche's formulation, there is no actor behind the action, there's only the action. Or as Lee put it, it hits all by itself, because the word I does not exist. To use the term popularised by Judith Butler, all there really is performativity. In this context, this implies that acting and enacting are essentially the same thing. Anthroptechnic matters of mimesis. To learn how to enact a punch, I must first learn how to act a punch. To learn how to put power into a punch, I must first imagine putting power into a punch. Some people, such as Bruce Lee, can then go on to perfect acting, putting power into a punch. This is not to say that the acted punch is not an enacted punch. It's rather that in the acted punch, the power is not ultimately directed at the target, even while it also potentially is. Rather, it's ultimately directed to the camera, for the viewer. Lee famously and confusingly called this acting unacting, or unacting acting. The punch is real, but the real point of contact is the camera, not the literal physical target. Second example. There's a scene in an old documentary about Jackie Chan in which a former martial arts competitor turned actor is trying to interact with Chan and execute the sequence of moves in a fight scene. The former competitor struggles to carry out the choreography correctly. This is because he keeps closing the gap between himself and his opponent, Jackie Chan. In moving in on his opponent and closing the gap, he's technically fighting well, advancing aggressively and putting pressure on at all times. However, for the sake of the camera or viewer, what is needed is that the fighters maintain a stable distance between each other, so that back and forth of the techniques can remain visible as crisp and precise and clear, and so that it can be captured by the camera and represented as, or as if, high skill level combat. Adherence to this stable distance back and forth convention is probably why I was never really a fan of Jackie Chan, which is not to say I didn't like Jackie Chan films. This is because it might be expressed as boiling down to a privileging of fa, or technical precision in execution, over gong, power in techniques. Bruce Lee, on the other hand, rarely demonstrated a wide range of so-called authentic techniques of Chinese martial arts. Many of his on-screen stances and poses, and especially the poses he would strike on photo shoots, were simply made up, invented and posed because they looked good. Many of his photo shoot poses are simple self-orientalization with no mimetic connection to authentic Chinese martial arts at all. Similarly, many of the techniques he executes on screen are not easily connected to any specific Chinese martial art either. Nonetheless, even when these movement images occur purely for their spectacular value, one might say that they still have a kind of fa, a technical plausibility, and an affective gong, or the capture and communication of a clear feeling of power. But here we must be clear. This communication of gong is a translation. It's what Ray Chow might call a cultural translation, the movement from one medium into another. In this case, a translation of gong from the haptic, interpersonal realm of embodied physical co-presence into the medium of cinematic, visual and audio capture. Ray Chow's theory of cultural translation is not the only theory available, nor is it the first or last word on the subject. Chow was heavily inspired by Walter Benjamin's theory of translation, for instance. What she takes from Benjamin is that translation always involves some form of transformation. To translate in terms of prioritizing a selected signified or meaning, a meaning, for instance, will inevitably come at a cost to the original signifier or the sensuousness of the sounds of the original words. On the other hand, to maintain fidelity to the sensuousness, grain, texture, aesthetics, or materiality of the source language will extract a cost in terms of fidelity to possible signifieds or meanings. In other words, translating or communicating across contexts, however defined, involves choices, inventions, and costs, or a necessary infidelity to the quest for one or another kind of fidelity. To my mind, and stated simply, Bruce Lee's cinematic choreography chose to try to capture and communicate the gong of the power of explosive techniques. Now, of course, any supposed sharp distinction between the cinematic realm of fake representations and the real physical realm of true embodied actions is hampered by the existence of documentary recording, audio, video, and still photography of that which really happens, whether spontaneously or otherwise really, in the real world. There are also deliberately staged representations that are enacted with pedagogical or documentary intent, and so on. Reciprocally, or viewed from the other direction, aficionados will also be aware that Bruce Lee was always very keen to insert arguments about real fighting into his fictional and dramatic TV and film appearances, whenever possible. In Longstreet, for example, Lee has his character give lectures on the principles of Jeet Kune Do. In Way of the Dragon, Lee has Tang Lung beat Chuck Norris's colt by liberating himself from the strictures of classical combat approaches. In Enter the Dragon, as we've already seen, Lee lectures Lau on the primacy of the proper psychological and emotional attitude needed to sublimate Fa into Gong. And by all accounts, Game of Death was to be an extended parable on the values of transcending the strictures of limited and limiting styles. Nonetheless, according to Dan Inosanto, his longtime friend and student, Lee himself would often evoke a distinction between flashy cinematic techniques for entertainment and simple and direct techniques for effective combat use. As Inosanto saw it, for Bruce Lee there was, so to speak, street Jeet Kune Do and screen or cinematic Jeet Kune Do. Cinematic Jeet Kune Do was bigger, flashier, more spectacular. Street Jeet Kune Do was straighter, tighter, more linear. The question is whether this is borne out by the available documentary or documented evidence. The increasing transfer of celluloid archive first onto the DVD extras and then onto platforms such as YouTube over the last few decades has made much more footage available to considerably more people. As a result, more commentators have had the opportunity to analyse Bruce Lee's technique, both in his films and in footage of him training, giving demonstrations, or training others. Interestingly, many such analyses zone in on one single technique. This is a technique that, along with his nunchaku use and his signature vocalizations, is almost synonymous with Bruce Lee himself. This is the sidekick. The force of Bruce Lee's semiotic association with the sidekick is strong. Arguably, he effectively changed its status. For although the sidekick has demonstrably existed for centuries and been applied in diverse contexts in different ways across cultures, it was arguably Bruce Lee's execution of it on screen that elevated it to such a new aesthetic status, in which it arguably came metonymically to stand for Asian martial arts tout court. That is, despite the sidekick's well-documented existence in, for example, historical European martial arts or French savate, Bruce Lee made the sidekick his own, made it stand for him for it, and both became the very symbolic encapsulation of Asian martial arts. So let's have a quick look at Lee's sidekick. Lots of other people already have. in books and magazines, and most recently in YouTube analysis videos. Such analyses examine one or more repository or genre of archival footage, whether final cut film fight footage, outtakes, home video footage, or footage of demonstrations, and so on. In the interest of brevity, I will make some sweeping statements about the conclusions drawn by most of the Bruce Lee breakdown analysis films I have seen. I've seen probably too many. So, first, the broad consensus out there is that Bruce Lee's sidekicks, as seen in his films, are powerful kicks delivered with significant force. The most famous sidekick may be the one he delivers to O'Hara in Enter the Dragon. The critics' view is that this is a real kick. Second, the sidekicks we see in his home video footage are also powerful. Third, the kicks we see Lee deliver in such contexts as his Long Beach sparring demonstrations in the 1960s, while being okay in and of themselves, are surrounded by some less than perfect movements and less than perfect techniques, which, as one interpreter puts it, suggest that at that time, Bruce Lee and his students did not seem to have done very much sparring, and certainly not by today's standards, even if they were responsible for raising the bar by putting the need for extra sparring out there. The question is what this might tell us about Bruce Lee's real fighting abilities. The answer at this point is very little, perhaps, other than that if he landed a sidekick on you, he could make a mess of you. But does this translate or equate into fighting ability? A good builder or joiner might be incredibly powerful and accurate with a hammer, but this does not mean that they are Thor, god of war. The truth is, we need to look directly at the elephant in the room, the notion of real fighting. It's actually hugely problematic and contains all manner of untenable assumptions and false universals. Most obviously, when people evoke or invoke real fighting, they tend to be thinking of something akin to a formal duel. But this is not in any way a universal or even particularly common real form of interpersonal violence. To elevate the myth of the fair fight or duel to the status of exemplar is a kind of romanticization and hypostatization, aka essentialism, of fighting, one that owes as much to familiarity with literary, theatrical and cinematic conventions as it does to sporting institutions such as boxing. However, when people evoke real fighting, many more qualifications and clarifications are required. Where? When? Why? With whom? How many? With what objectives? Under what conditions? Under what legal system? What social and cultural institutions supervene? What's the anthropotechnic environment? And so on. In other words, the question of real fighting is like any other question of the real, namely mired in uninterrogated generalizations and preconceptions, and based on a cultural fantasy scenario elevated to the status of norm, ideal, or yardstick. What I've just said, will seem painfully obvious to many self-defense researchers and teachers. However, it's also painfully obvious that many martial artists either remain ignorant of or choose to ignore such matters. Thus, we return to the real-unreal binary, or the question of whether the gym is a lab or a soft play area. And I don't want to get pulled back into this black hole or cul-de-sac. I'd rather go somewhere less obvious, but perhaps more informative, and look at the evidence and ask about medium-specific matters of technical performance, or the performance of technique across different media contexts. That is, I want to examine the way a technique is translated from medium to medium, context to context. There are, of course, many possible ways to divide up the space-time continuum in order to specify and delimit a technique. For now, let's just use conventional terms and boundaries and equate technique to conventional units such as this or that kind of kick, punch, strike, lock, hold or throw, etc. Obviously, we might also want to define micro-movements, subtle interactions, feints, deceptions and other elements of interactions with opponents, the camera or the environment as specific techniques to be isolated and exampled later. But for now, let us start with the sidekick, and let us consider how it's executed or depicted across media. In terms of the stark schema of real versus unreal, we can ask, is Bruce Lee's sidekick a flashy, spectacular cinematic technique, or is it one of Street Jeet Kune Do's preferred efficient, simple and direct techniques? It's certainly flashy. A sidekick is not a natural move. It requires training, anthropotechnic skill acquisition. Nonetheless, across all recorded contexts, Lee gives prime position to the sidekick. He does so cinematically in those huge jumping sidekicks and skip and step in sidekicks and so on. He also does so in television, in the Jeet Kune Do episode of Longstreet, for example, and he does so in many home training videos. This is because the sidekick is a kick that needs to be trained. You don't train it, you can't do it. Interestingly, he also centralizes it in ostensibly practical or pedagogical publications. The front cover and the entirety of the first chapter of his posthumously published book, Bruce Lee's Fighting Method, Self-Defense Techniques, for instance, is saturated with sidekicks. On the front cover, Lee sidekicks an opponent up into the air. On the contents page, he sidekicks an attacker on the street squarely in the chest. On the next page, he sidekicks another in the leg. On the next, he sidekicks to the front of the knee. On the next, he sidekicks to the back of the knee. On the next, he sidekicks to a groin. On the next, the chest, and so on. So, it's sidekicks on the cover, the contents page, and through the entire first chapter. If this is not elevating the sidekick to primacy, I don't know what is. Of course, this book was published posthumously, so Bruce Lee cannot be held personally responsible for its final design. But the very existence of these photographs suggests that Lee regarded the sidekick, even the high sidekick, to be not just a flashy cinematic display, but also an entirely valid, perhaps even primary, self-defense technique to be used in real fighting on the street. Thus, the sidekick is both one of the most spectacular cinematic techniques, fast, explosive, devastating, beautiful, sublime even, and also one of Bruce Lee's favourite practical techniques, adhering to all of the principles of efficiency and efficacy that he advocated as a martial artist. It is also a fairly clear example of anthropotechnics. For the sidekick to come easy, to seem natural, especially if it is to become a reflex response to a surprise attack, this requires training, lots and lots of training. Training in how to execute the movement and training in how to execute it automatically or pre-reflexively as a rapid response to a fluid situation. The question is, what does this teach us about reality? Was Lee's cinematic choreography informed and infused with his street-level pragmatism, or was his pragmatic and practical thinking and innovation in and around martial arts unwittingly mortgaged to cinematic performance? But differently, when we see Bruce Lee kicking the heavy bag outside his home, we know he's training. But what's he training for? The street or the screen? Or is he indeed, in his classroom, training for the lesson? The most we can say is that he's training for performance. An insight attributed to Miyamoto Musashi is that you can only fight the way you train. That training becomes you. Our training is always infused and organised by a theory of practice, whether explicit or tacit, whether we know it or not. This is why there is no fixed ontological stability to either the form or content of combat. Street combat can easily be informed by the cinematic. Cinematic combat can easily be informed by the street. Not to mention any of the other contingent contexts of life. The human is environmental, ethological, biosemiotic, and always invented. As Lee famously said, humans have at most 2 hands and 2 feet. This led him to ask rhetorically, how many ways of fighting can there really be? His belief was that ultimately such small and equally shared numbers of limbs and digits should tend towards universality, that styles were limitations, ossifications, and strictures. What he'd not finished thinking through were the full implications of the fact that you can only fight the way you train, and that there are unknown and unknowable numbers of ways to train. Furthermore, the way you train both informs and is informed by the way you think, and the way you think is saturated and saturating, full of dissolved representations, imaginations, theorizations, and images and lessons from one's surroundings, from the cinematic to the poetic. We pick up from what surrounds us, just like water. However, unlike water, we do so in unpredictable ways. The norm may be 2 hands and 2 feet, yes, but each of my hands is different to its other, as are yours. So that's an awful lot of very different hands and feet, each in different places, informed by different ideas, beliefs, ideologies, ethics, each trained differently. This is why, for Sloterdijk, there are as many umvelds or environments as there are living organisms, and why there must be a shattering of any monological metaphysics which explains the world as monocontext and projects it onto a single eye. This, for Sloterdijk, must be replaced with a pluralistic ontology which introduces so many worlds without having recourse to the hypostasis of an eye of all eyes. This line of thought can take us both to some predictable and to some unpredictable places. One tedious place is tired old talk of relativism, a term that has very limited value for any theoretical or practical purpose I can think of other than policing established senses of the proper. Rather than go back there again, I would prefer, like Deleuze and Guattari perhaps, to focus on the interactive character of umwelt, or rather on the fact that it includes a dialogue between parts of entities and thus presupposes a movement of opening up pre-established entities. I like this phrase, a dialogue between parts of entities. Might this be a fruitful and worthwhile image? Might it help us to escape from naive misapprehensions of the supposed relationships between representation and reality? I might see Bruce Lee's dramatic cinematic sidekicks. I might devote my life and all my training to this technique, and I might use it wherever I like. And when I do, it will always have the status of Schrodinger's sidekick, undecidedly present and absent, double and spectral, real and unreal, fantasy and pragmatic, and more at the same time. In fact, might the phrase, a dialogue between parts of entities, also offer a new definition of Jeet Kune Do? I'm thinking of Lee in Longstreet throwing a kick to the knee and lecturing, I see your approach and I intercept it. A dialogue between movements expressed as a strike to the knee. Indeed, might a dialogue between parts of entities also express the sentiment in Enter the Dragon that the highest technique is to have no technique, to reach the point where Gong or Yi sublimates Fa, to have no technique because the word I does not exist, only emotional content in a dialogue between parts of entities. To my mind, and in conclusion, this is at least part of what is interesting and important about part of the relationships between Bruce Lee's action techniques and anthropotechnics, and at least part of what Bruce Lee's choreography can teach us about reality.
Okay, many thanks for that, Paul. I think we have probably 10, maybe a bit more time, 10 minutes, and you can use the chat feature still to ask your questions, or of course, maybe use the raise hand feature in Zoom, and that will shunt you up to the top left of our screen. We can work through questions that way. So anyone, please, someone's right there. Ask away, unmute.
Is that, yeah, hello. That was just a fabulous presentation, Paul. And, I've been following many of your presentations on YouTube and other places, and, you're evolving every time. It's quite nice to see how you are now moving up to, I would call it an ontological or epistemological level, although you might be reluctant to use those terms, I'm not sure. However, the ending, which I found really intriguing, it brings up the question of the subject again, right? I mean, what is the I? What remains of the I when all technique is gone? And I'm a bit puzzled that you don't bring in Lacan into your analysis and his notion of how the ego or the I comes into being. And I think also the notion of the real in Lacan would be relevant to you. I don't know if you want to comment on that. How come you want to let that not let that into your argument here? Thanks.
Yeah, look, thank you. That's a really lovely thing to say, and it's a really good question. I would say that you're probably right in terms of me thinking about the kind of ontology of fighting, if we want to use that term. I'm interested in that because there are debates, interminable debates around the fields of martial arts studies about which is the best which is the best way of fighting, and like what's the true and which is the closest to the real, and so on. And so I'm interested in tackling that, but using cultural theory to do so. And the reason why Lacan doesn't feature today is because I think probably I always started from Lacan. I mean, if you look back at the first things I ever wrote about Bruce Lee or about martial arts, it was Derrida and Lacan. And what I wasn't doing was thinking about other thinkers like Deleuze, and certainly not someone like Peter Sloterdijk. But I found that I've become increasingly interested in the kind of conceptual reserves that you can gain by thinking about using Sloterdijk and maybe Deleuze to think about this. And it's not so much that I'm not thinking about the constitution of the I in a Lacanian sense. It's more thinking about the nature of the physical embodied being in their becoming a subject. I don't think it contradicts anything in Lacan. I just think that I've done that so many times. I've talked about Lacan. I teach Lacan. I lecture on Lacan, and I just think that I'd like to explore the embodied and possibly also some of the philosophical ontological issues around the subject through a different set of concepts. Because I get quite bored of proving that Lacan was right or Derrida was right, or it's like, yeah, okay, but what else? What else is going on here? And that's when the body comes in, because neither of them have a huge amount to say about the body, whereas first for me, it was actually Sloterdijk first, and then that was a key for me to be able to appreciate more about Deleuze subsequently, I think. The Deleuze is a recent thing for me. Is that Wayne?
Yeah.
Wayne?
It's Wayne.
Thanks so much, Paul, for your fascinating talk. So I just wonder if we talk about cinema study. So do you think that the current approaches in cinema study seems to focus a lot on the formal aspects of martial arts, like how they appear on the film, rather than looking at martial arts per se? Because when you talk about ontology of martial arts, right? So how can we formulate like film aesthetics or film theories based on martial art ontology rather than looking at it from a genre perspective? Because if we talk about how Bruce Lee incorporate like real martial art techniques into cinema, so can we begin from martial art techniques themselves rather than from the cinema point of view? So would that be an interesting point of like departure to formulate new ways of understanding martial art cinema, from the techniques and how the techniques affect the aesthetics and of course its connection to philosophy?
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. This is the kind of thing I would ask you about. I think I would be asking you to talk about this, but for me, I would I would want to think back to just the different cinematic attempts to capture something real, and this is what I was saying about translation. Like there's always a choice, like what do you capture? So if you look at the choreography that Jackie Chan became famous for and contrast it with Bruce Lee, or then you could go like Wong Kar-wai, or another great film, you could look at the choreography in The Raid and the cinematography in The Raid. They all choose different aspects of, or any fight choreography, the director and the production selects different aspects to foreground. So I think that, I mean, your question about the relationship between that and kind of embodied physicality of people who actually do martial art is a really complicated one, and that interests me too. I haven't got a definitive answer, and it would take quite a long time, I think, to unpack that. But I think that I would want to have a long conversation with you about that. I think we should have that. We should do a conference about this. And I can't give a quick and easy answer today, but it's definitely a conversation that we should continue having, because the relationship between film, media representation, gaming, and all the rest of it, and what people physically practice is something that is endlessly fascinating to me.
Thanks so much, Paul. Thank you.
Okay. Anyone else have any questions either through chat or to raise your hand?
Oh, there's a question down there in the chat. I wonder if and how capoeira could possibly inform your approach, given that one may speak of players rather than fighters, that kicks are not necessarily meant to hit the other player, that there should be a dialogue between the two players, or yet the assumed energetic connection between the two players and the group surrounding them. Yeah, I think that's an important dimension that is often missing from, I think the kind of conversations that I'm trying to intervene in are questions about the status of simple status between the relationship between the real, or reality rather, and representation. That's a simple binary that exists all over the place, and that's why I insist on it. It's a frustrating one. It's one that many scholars would want to just move away from, but I want to reference it because it exists out there in the real world of discourse. But when you start to look at specific contexts and you become kind of respectful and sensitive to the specificity of different contexts and different practices, that's when you start to learn an awful lot more about the complexity of performance and interaction. So it looks like I wouldn't disagree with you at all, because I think this aligns with a lot of what I'm saying about drawing attention to the status of performance and different contexts, across different media, different social, ritual, cultural, historical contexts. I've never really written about capoeira. I've never really focused on it because I tend to like to have a physical experience of the thing that I'm writing about. I tend to want to know what it feels like, and I've never played capoeira, and I think I'm far too old. So I probably will never write about capoeira, especially with my bad back that I currently have. My writing tends to follow my activities, but capoeira, I mean, there's a lot of really interesting, actually some of the most interesting kind of martial arts studies work is focusing on things like capoeira. There's some really interesting books coming out over recent years. Lauren Griffith's work, for instance, and other people. Capoeira is a really interesting one, I think. Yeah, I'll leave it at that for the capoeira stuff.
Okay, we have time for another question.
David, I don't see the option to raise my hand, so I'm asking right straight. Can you hear me?
Sure, can hear you.
Okay. Paul, thanks so much for the presentation. It's been great. At the very beginning, you have shown a picture of Muhammad Ali. I think it's a very interesting reference to bring in because Ali was very cinematic in his approach, at least, or theatrical in his approach to boxing. And it's just an anecdote, but I don't know if you probably you have heard of a series that is called Better Call Saul. And it's an ongoing series. It's related to the famous Breaking Bad. It's a spin-off. And I was watching the series last weeks, and there is an interesting conversation in an office where two guys are discussing about hypothetical context of fight between Ali and Bruce Lee. And the main arguments are bringing Bruce Lee speed and Ali's power and professionality, the professionality of the boxer, that is different from the martial artist. And there's a third guy that enters and just asks, does Bruce Lee have a gun? And the lead Bruce Lee defender says, what? Sorry, what? Can you go again? And it's, does Bruce Lee have a gun? Because if not, there's no discussion on the table. So it made me think about that idea of real, what is real, that's, Ali, who was in a good sense a great performer, and Bruce Lee, who was an actor but maybe not seen as a fighter. What your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, there's an article that we published in Martial Arts Studies written by Jared Miracle, and it was about the time that Ali tried to fight like a judo guy, wrestler guy. And it was so, to try and establish, so like, who's the greatest fighter? And it was very theatrical, and the rules were constantly changing because no one wanted like Ali to actually get hurt. So they made it more or less impossible for the grappler to be able to win, but it had to be a spectacle. And the whole thing was a catastrophic failure and an embarrassment. But it illustrates the way in which that frame, I mean, the literal frame of the boxing ring or the octagon or the whatever the frame is, massively determines our sense of what's real, what's true, what's possible. If you change the physical dynamics of an environment in which something happens, then you change the reality or the truth of that thing. If MMA fighters weren't in an octagon but were on a sloping surface and there's crocodiles swimming around beneath them, you're going to get a very different kind of fight. If you're not wearing gloves, right, this would be one of the best ways to make boxing as safe as possible. Just no gloves allowed, because people stop punching each other in the head. Then you stop getting the brain damage. People punch each other in the body, which is awful. But so yeah, so that whole thing about, but has he got a gun? Has he got a hand grenade? Has he got a? This is what I think Dan Inosanto said, this conversation between him and Bruce Lee, like, which is the best weapon, a knife, a handgun, or a hand grenade. It's like, well, where am I? Am I in an elevator with you? Then the hand grenade's going to be an awful weapon. But it's everything is, this is why I keep coming back to Derrida. Like, that there is only context. There's nothing outside of that context. Like, there is no sort of trans-contextual universal reality or truth to this entity. The entity only comes into existence in some kind of social, material context. I mean, if there weren't such things as bouncy rubber mats, then you wouldn't have Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. It wouldn't look the way it does. People wouldn't be behaving in this way. So yeah, I mean, the whole, that question, who would have won in a fight between Bruce Lee and Muhammad Ali? It's just like, oh man. After I was in that documentary about Bruce Lee, literally when it screened on American television, the next day I woke up, I put my email from a guy in America, but who would have won in a fight, Bruce Lee or Muhammad Ali? It's like, oh, give me a break. But also that was a question directed specifically to me. So there was one of my friends, Terry Tom, Asian American woman, she was in that film, and the day after that aired on American television, she got a very different range of unending questions. I got one email from one guy, who would have won in a fight? She got millions of all sorts of predatory, lascivious, kind of weird, pervy email. So I think that's an important point to make, actually. What kind of questions are stimulated by what kind of interlocutor, what kind of person. But yeah, I would put my money on Muhammad Ali, heavyweight boxer, someone who's my size. But who's got the gun? Who's got the knife?
Yeah, I think the series is making fun and being serious at the same time, because the whole context is of humor. They are just making fun of the conversation, and about the question itself.
It's such a
You know,
cultural theme. I mean, the very fixation on that question. It's such a strangely symptomatic, eternally recurring question. It's still, you know, we talked about this, Megan, didn't we? But in Cardiff a few years ago at that Bruce Lee conference, like the questions that are most asked, that's got to be there in the top 5. Like, who would have won in a fight? Why that question? Why does everyone feel compelled to ask that question? The other question that I'm most familiar with, of course, is which one's Bruce Lee again? Is that Jackie Chan or is that Bruce Lee? Which one? That's like question number 1. Oh, Bruce Lee, is he the one with a cartoon? No, is that Jackie Chan? And then question number 2 is like, you know, the Muhammad Ali one. Question number 3 is, why are you into Bruce Lee? It's again and again and again. And you just asked a similar question, or talked about a television program asking a similar question. Really interesting. There's got to be an interesting Lacanian psychoanalytic ideology type study there. Why this question? Fascinating.
You think that maybe it's inherited from the dojo, you know, that my master is better than your master, you know? In Japanese culture, is a whole culture of one master. You see that in Bruce Lee's movie, no?
I don't know if I've ever heard of a martial artist as such asking that question. It always just seems to be like some bloke who's just gone, oh, some guy in the pub or something, like, who do you think would have won that? and it's to try and diagnose that would be a really interesting kind of a cultural study, I think. But I don't think I've got the emotional strength to go there. I keep trying to not talk about Bruce Lee. I keep trying to escape from Bruce Lee, but I guess it's a life sentence.
Yeah, sorry about that, Paul. Got you here again.
Your fault, wasn't it?
Yeah. Okay, thanks, Eduardo. Any further questions for Paul before we wrap up? Just maybe I can make a comment. Have you ever read I Am Jackie Chan, My Life in Action? Not that I think you should have, but the very first page of that is quite an interesting kind of setup. It's very, very short. It's obviously ghostwritten. This is not, I imagine, Jackie Chan really thinking it through himself, but he's thinking about a stunt he's going to do, and his stuntman has done a rehearsal, and he's done 7 stories dropping off a building. Jackie Chan's saying, I can't do 7 stories. I'm going to do the whole building. And at the bottom of the page, he's like, if I don't do the whole building, who would I be? Not Jackie Chan, full stop. And, the subtitle, My Life in Action, is it seems very kind of simple in some ways, but I suppose it's actually, you could be quite complimentary about the way this book thinks through some of this kind of thing. And I was thinking about this because I read that he actually was he was trying to get the finance together to put it on screen, but it wasn't going to be a documentary. It was going to be a musical, which is a really quite peculiar thought. And so I'm sympathetic to your position on Jackie Chan, but I know you find him very interesting. But he's a totally different kind of world of eccentricities and peculiarities, not to mention the politics as well as things.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing, isn't it? I mean, there's the performance, there's the celebrity, and there's a different time and place, a different roles that they wanted to establish for themselves. And there's also the way in which, posthumously Bruce Lee's kind of individualist, kind of libertarian ideology gets translated into political terms or potential mobilizations, certainly on an emotional level, whereas Jackie Chan has moved into making direct political statements and affiliations and so on. I guess it's that kind of Obi-Wan Kenobi thing, isn't it? If you should strike me down, I'll become more powerful than you could possibly imagine, but anyone can manipulate. I mean, I don't know. We talked about whether we were going to talk about the whole Be Water umbrella movement and the politics that's happening in Hong Kong at the moment. I don't really feel literate enough to comment on that fully, but I have been thinking about that over the last few days about the status and meaning or usefulness of that whole kind of image as a political force. It would be very interesting to find out much. It would need to be a proper study and not just some middle-aged man in England saying some stuff about Hong Kong. I think that seems I raise it as only as a thing that I think demands, you know, really detailed study and reflection. Very interesting though. Bruce Lee in politics. Bruce Lee in cultural politics.
I think I mentioned when I suggested you could talk about Bruce Lee, apologies again, that in fact the Hong Kong Heritage Museum had reopened this very long-standing exhibition, and you know, at the Heritage Museum, I mean, there's lots of ways that you might begin with that kind of thing, and it was quite a big media event, even within the terms of a kind of COVID situation over the last few months here. So it was something that certainly you could begin a little bit of an in-depth study. Anyway, thank you. Any final questions? Or I'm sure you'll want to join me in thanking Paul for a fascinating talk and a great video, which, yeah, good stuff. Thanks very much, Paul.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone for coming, and enjoy the summer. Pretty much.
Thank you very much.
Thanks,
Cheers,
everyone. Bye-bye.